Let us pray. Loving God, we give you thanks for the beauty and the joy and the blessing of your creation. We have gathered here tonight to hear how some have struggled to better care for it. Some progress has been made, much more needs to be done very soon. Guide us in our times of discussion, learning, inspire us to be all the more faithful stewards of your creation. For we pray it in the name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Amen. So we're very happy to have all of you gathered here. I am Bruce Gillette, the moderator of Presbyterians for Earth Care, and I want to give thanks to my friend and colleague, Mark, is a Emmy-winning celebrity oceanographer. If you are familiar with Netflix, there was an excellent documentary that Mark was a consultant and featured somewhat in called Chasing Coral. And right now, Netflix has that as a freebie, at least it was a few days ago on YouTube. So you can, but it's well worth looking at how Mark, working with NOAA, has, through satellites, helped see the destruction of coral from climate change. He has done amazing work, and he was one of our key speakers this past summer. We had 3 Sunday afternoon conference, and you can find all of those talks on YouTube, and you're welcome to use them in your churches. Enough of introduction. Mark, take it away. And we'll move to speaker. I'd ask you all to mute yourselves if you're not asking a question.
Great, thanks. And indeed, Netflix is supposed to keep Chasing Coral on their YouTube channel. It's one of the things that they've moved over for permanent distribution for free. So it's a great chance to see Chasing Coral, whether you have Netflix or not. So I'm going to start out this evening by going through and giving you a quick rundown on kind of where we got to with COP26. I was not present. I'm hoping we'll be having a couple of people on who were present during this, but this is just sort of an analysis, and I'll in fact start by explaining a few things for those who are not familiar with all of the lingo and process and just what it means. So let me go ahead and share my screen. That look good to everybody? Bruce? Good. Okay, great. So COP26, the real question at this point is, where are we compared to 2 degrees of warming? Where are we compared to 1.5 degrees of warming? These are very important numbers, and we'll get into those a little bit so you can understand why so much importance is placed on those numbers. This is that animation you were seeing there is actually from a New York Times article. The special report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that came out in 2018, comparing the impacts of having a 1.5 versus 2 degree world, was in fact something that was required as a product that came out of one of the COP meetings, where they required that this report come out. I believe, in fact, that was the Paris meeting in 2015 that required that this report be produced in the next few years, which they did. And it looks at these 2 trajectories that you're seeing on the far right, 1.5 versus 2 degrees. But to put that in a scale that's relevant to us, where are we now? Well, depending on the year in the past few years, we've been anywhere from 0.6 to over 1.2 degrees above during some part of the year. What you're looking at here are some NOAA data showing the global average temperatures on a month-by-month, year-to-date basis. So the first dots are going to be January, the second dots are going to be January and February, February, March, etc., until you get to the far right, and that's where the years ended up. So we look at total years. these years that you're looking at, which range from 2005 to today, are between about 0.65 and 1 degree warmer than the 20th century average temperature. The black one you see that's incomplete in the middle is 2021, that's this year. We're going to fall into the top 10. It looks like it's going to come in at about number 6 or 7 for the year. At this point, it'd be hard to nudge it off of where it is very far. And so that means that we're looking at, after this year, all of the top 10 warmest years on record are since 2010. So if you think about that, from a record that goes back into the 1800s, those 10 warmest years will all have been since 2010 once we get to the end of this year. So that's pretty impressive and shows just how much warming there's been and how different conditions are now. For younger people, you know, anyone 45 years old or younger, every year of their life has been warmer than average. So that's a pretty impressive record that we have going, unfortunately. So let's look at this 1.5 versus 2 degrees. This is looking at ice-free summers. So looking at the Arctic and how much of the ice disappears. And ice-free doesn't mean that there's absolutely no ice, but it means there's no permanent ice. And ice-free summers become 10 times more likely at 2 degrees than at 1.5 degrees. Looking at heat waves closer to home, extreme heat waves, which we've been seeing, the impacts that they've been having on people around the world. 1.5 degrees C, 14% of the world population is being impacted at any time in any year by extreme heat waves. And at 2 degrees C, 37% of the world's population will be getting hit by extreme heat waves. Sea level rise. At 1.5 versus 2 degrees, we're talking about flooding, exposing from 31 to 80 million people worldwide, flooding due to sea level rise alone. And that, of course, is the higher number of up to 80 is at 2 degrees C. And severe drought, people who don't have enough water supply. We're looking at 350 million people exposed, urban people exposed to severe drought at 1.5 degrees C. And at 411, at 2 degrees C, we're looking at 411 million people. Finally, crop yields. We're going to be seeing lower crop yields around the world. We're also going to be seeing a change in range of organisms, especially insects. So at 1.5 degrees, we're likely to lose 6% of insects, 8% of plants. At 2 degrees C, 18% of insects and 16% of plants. So if you're looking at this and saying, well, yeah, I really wouldn't mind a few less ants and bothering my picnic or mosquitoes and things, just remember that a lot of these are also those important insects that eat other insects or that pollinate our crops. So getting down to Glasgow, the COP26 meeting, give you a little history. All of this started in 1992 in the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. 1992 actually formed the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, what's referred to as the UNFCCC. And that body, that convention, established an international environmental treaty to combat dangerous human interference with the climate system. So that was the beginning of what we're seeing and referred to as the Conference of Parties. The COP26 that we just had comes from the meetings that followed and are conventions of the parties or the signatories to this framework convention, who are now getting together on an annual basis. COP3 in Kyoto in 1997. So you see, it took them a couple of years to get the first one, which was held in Berlin. COP3 in 1997 was in Kyoto, Japan. The Kyoto Protocol is a very important protocol that was set up under this. And it was in effect from 2005 to 2020, and was the first part of the implementation of actual measures of things that needed to be done to try and deal with this dangerous interference with the climate system. Much more recently, in Paris in 2015, this is the agreement that most people think of. They forget that the Kyoto was a very important agreement prior to that. Paris did a much better job of establishing some solid baselines and some solid requirements for countries to deal with climate change. And the important language, among other, one of the most important bits of language was to limit warming below 2 degrees C and strive to keep temperature at 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. So that's that 1.5 and 2 degrees we were talking about. 2 degrees is interesting because it's not that there was a whole lot of science that went into exactly 2 degrees and why that should be there. Early on in these protocols, there was political pressure being placed on scientists who were talking about avoiding warming. And the pressure was really to just give a number, what above what is so bad we don't want to go there. And scientists basically said, we absolutely do not want to go above 2 degrees C. And okay, politicians said, yeah, that's the number we'll shoot for then. Of course, that doesn't solve all the problems. And in fact, even 1.5 degrees, and the reason this came out in Paris is because many of the small islands in developing states were calling for a lower limit, 1.5 degrees C, because the impact that was going to have on their homes, on their countries, on their livelihoods, the impact, especially in the developing world, and for many ecosystems, was going to be so great at even 1.5 degrees C that needed to be on the table. And so Paris was really rather monumental, because not only were there the agreements to keep below 2, but at that point to strive to keep at 1.5 degrees in the long term. Now, that doesn't mean that we won't overshoot it and come back. And we'll discuss that a bit later on. So finally, COP26 in Glasgow this year. So under the Paris Agreement, countries had to increase their ambition every 5 years. Of course, 5 years would have been 2020. There was COVID. They got a pass on that. There was a virtual conference that did a bunch of stuff. Glasgow, COP26 was pushed back a year as an official meeting to this year. And so, the question is, what happened in Glasgow? But first, before we get to Glasgow, let's look at where people were thinking this was going to go. There wasn't a huge amount of optimism. This article by Eugene Robinson of the Washington Post, columnist, opinion: the smart money on climate seems to be barely mitigated doom. And Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, says, and this is leaving Rome after the G20 meeting in preparation for the COP. I leave Rome with my hopes unfulfilled, but at least they are not buried. So the G20 nations had made some progress in getting ready for Glasgow, but not nearly what he was hoping for. Another is Eakin Steiner, who's the program administrator for the UN Development Program. We're gaining momentum, but far behind. So, optimism, very guarded optimism at best. And when we look at what actually was achieved, here are a couple of quotes from John Kerry. One of them, we all know that old adage that you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So clearly, Glasgow didn't get as far as many people wanted, including people like himself. But he does say something that is very valuable. We are in fact closer than we have ever been before to avoiding climate chaos and securing cleaner air, safer water, and a healthier planet. He doesn't say how close we are, he just says closer. So let's go through this bit by bit. These are some of the big discussion items that were in Glasgow and were part of the agreements that came out. Coal. There was language that it was brought to the table for the agreement to say that the countries were going to phase out coal. And instead, the agreement said that countries would phase down unabated coal. Yeah, wishy-washy to 2 degrees. But the nice thing is that the thing that was achieved here was, for the very first time, believe it or not, in one of these agreements, it acknowledged the need to transition off of fossil fuels. The statements that we needed to move off fossil fuels were there. Well, speaking of that, subsidies. One of the ways we keep fossil fuels going is because there are tens of trillions of dollars of fossil fuel subsidies supplied to the industries every year, looking across the globe. And the target language that was put in was to end fossil fuel subsidies, and instead the language became phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. No definition of what they're inefficient at doing, so that's not the greatest. What about emissions and emission reductions? So what they had been coming in with were these distant net zero targets. In other words, countries saying what they were going to do to reach the point where there were net zero emissions, no more added carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And the good thing is, they not only did that, but we did see coming into this and through Glasgow, almost a 50% reduction in emissions during the next decade, about 45%. Now, how countries are going to get there is another question. We haven't been very good at getting to where we've been targeting, but that is a move in the right direction. So the target by 2030 that emissions need to fall around 45% by 2030. Well, the expectations based on what countries have been doing so far and likely changes, we may actually be seeing a rise by 14% by 2030. So we're continuing to have an increase in emissions as we have been, but at least the rise is slowing down. So that's kind of like knowing that the bridge is out and you back off the accelerator just a little bit so you're not gaining as much speed heading toward the precipice as you were before. Okay, well, it's progress. One thing I'll mention again in a few minutes is the whole idea of a cost on carbon, or paying for the carbon that goes into the atmosphere and oceans. And the nice thing is the agreement did call for putting together rules for global carbon markets. So that was a real step forward. That was something that was not in place before. There's nothing absolute, the markets aren't in place and so forth, but they did agree to start setting up these rules. Loss and damage. This has been a real politically explosive term. What this means is for those developed countries and even large emitting developing countries, for the damage that is already being done and has been done, is already being done and will be done, having those countries have to make payments to account for the damage that was done, sort of a climate scale reparations. There was no agreement to do this, but there was an agreement to start a dialogue about loss and damage. So at least there'll be more talk about it, and there'll be talk between the COPs about it. Climate Fund. This is the international funding for developing countries, and the target had been and this target had been set, I believe, from Paris. It may have been subsequent to Paris, but was supposed to be 20 billion per year by 2020, and we haven't gotten there. And this isn't just the U.S. The U.S. has their contribution to this, but it's all the countries around the world who are putting money into this climate fund, primarily the G20, the developed countries. And what they agreed to is that indeed we will reach 100 billion per year by 2023. And so this funding would be available for developing nations to be able to do a better job of moving toward an economy free of fossil fuels, as well as adapting to the damage that's occurring. Not only would we reach it by 2023, but by 2025 there would be makeup payments. So, you know, what is it? I will gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today. You know, there was a promise to get to make up for where we were supposed to have gotten. There was a real push for a climate target of 1.5 degrees. The good news is where we were at just shy of 4 degrees prior to the ratcheting up of emission reductions going into this meeting, we're now at perhaps less than 2 degrees in the promises. And I'll show a couple of graphics on that in a sec. So, you know, we didn't get as far as we'd need to get to 1.5 degrees, but there was progress, and maybe if we can actually have all of these countries live up to what they've claimed, be able to stay just below 2 degrees. The plan was that every 5 years, countries would be updating their nationally determined contributions. In other words, the amount of CO2 they were saying was going to go into the atmosphere, and that this was a ratchet process. This was an important part of the Paris Agreement, was every 5 years they would get back together and you could only ratchet down, you couldn't go up. So updates were required in 2021, and most countries did update their nationally determined contributions. And even better, where going into Glasgow, it was supposed to be a cycle of every 5 years, there was a push to revisit them every year. Probably not going to happen, and I'm not sure that's really needed anyway, but there was a request for all countries to revisit and strengthen them in 2022. So knowing where we are, you know, we've got to come back to the table next year and do a little bit better. A new thing that occurred, which had not been an original target, but had developed, which is great, which is 100 countries signed the Global Methane Pledge, which is calling for a 30% reduction in methane releases to the atmosphere. As many of you know, methane is a much more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. Fortunately, it's short-lived, but it's being released more and more from gas and oil production, as well as transportation and use of gas. So this pledge is a great step forward for dealing with one of those important greenhouse gases. And the other thing that came out was a pledge to halt deforestation by 2030. We'll see again how well that goes, especially in places where deforestation has been a major problem. So, you know, thinking about what goes on, this is an image actually, sorry, it's a little fuzzy. This is from the 2021 report on global carbon cycle, which is currently in draft form. So this was available. And what you're looking at is a sort of a visualization of all of the places, the puts and takes of how much carbon there is in the atmosphere, in the ocean, in the soil, how much of that goes into the atmosphere, comes out of the atmosphere. These are all the places where you have increases and decreases, and it's a major modeling exercise that's done every year. And when we go through and compare that to the promises that came about going into the Glasgow meeting, you end up with a number of different targets. And these are some of the things that were coming in, and the reason why, you know, the question is really a valid one still: can we even stay within 2 degrees? To stay within the 2 degrees C range of warming requires that countries not only do their unconditional pledges, the things they've said, absolutely, we will do this, but there are a lot of conditional pledges where there maybe this, maybe that, and it depends on, and so forth. We have to have all of those nationally determined contributions and pledges fulfilled to be able to stay within that 2 degree range. And that's a target that a lot of countries have set, but it's going to be difficult. We have to do a whole lot more to be able to stay in a 1.5 degree world. In fact, for a 1.5 degree world, we can only have about 430 parts per million of CO2 equivalent in the atmosphere. We've already gone from 280 parts per million pre-industrial to now at over 410 parts per million in the atmosphere. So we're getting real close to that 1.5 degree target. To be honest, I don't see any way we can stay within 1.5. It may be possible in the long run to get back down to it. In fact, that's the concern that most experts have regarding even the 2 degree range, is that we're likely to overshoot that 2 degree target and then come back down. When we look at this over the long term, these are sort of the reductions in emissions we have to do relative to today and relative to the 2030 ambitions that you were seeing in terms of those pledges in Glasgow. And so it's a lot of work to reduce, but you can see that we're talking about major reductions in emissions in the 2 degree range, where we're cutting emissions by more than half. And to stay within 1.5 degrees, we're looking at a net zero target that has to occur somewhere just past 2050. So that's not very far out in the future. So how do we do this? You know, I mentioned these net zero things, and one of the things that I want to make sure everyone understands, because most people don't, is all of these emission targets to reach 2 degrees, to reach 1.5 degrees, and all of these statements about overshooting and coming down, all of these require something referred to as negative emissions. That means pulling CO2 back out of the atmosphere. And that's a difficult thing. It's being done in some places now. Some of it can be done by planting trees, but we can't plant nearly enough trees to pull all that CO2 out. So what companies are looking at is these new projects that pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. This is a system in Switzerland where they have a small scale industrial facility pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. Some of these pump it underground. Some of these take the CO2, make it use solar or wind and make it into a fuel like jet fuel, so that we can have jets continue to fly without causing to the additional emissions. This one, which is still small scale, actually is providing the carbonation that's needed for all of Coca-Cola products in Switzerland. So if you're ever in Switzerland and you drink a Coke, that CO2 has come out of the atmosphere. Thinking about this, we really need to be thinking about how we go about this, how we have this negative emission, and it really requires putting a price on carbon. This is a great quote that I love from Bob Inglis. He's a 6-term former Republican congressman from South Carolina, and the fact that he's addressing climate change is why he's a former congressman. In one version of this quote, he says, No more dumping into the sky, into the trash dump of the sky without paying tipping fees for the damages you're causing there. And that's what we've been doing. It's like allowing people to just dump trash wherever they want. They've been able to do it because they haven't been able to see it. Now, the good news is the Presbyterian Church has gotten to some extent on the right side of this issue. And in the General Assembly in St. Louis a couple of years ago, passed the overture on supporting carbon pricing. Not that that's actually gotten us carbon pricing, and even in the bills that are before Congress now, there's no carbon pricing, but we need to get a system in place that puts a price on carbon, that requires that for carbon going into the atmosphere, you pay something and that money can then be used to help resolve the problem. And there are fee and dividend approaches, carbon tax and dividend. There are all kinds of ways this can be done. And it really is something that we need to support and need to get on the books in the United States and elsewhere in the world. And this was one thing that was listed, is putting together global carbon markets. The last thing that we can do is look at divesting from fossil fuels. We, as a Presbyterian Church, continue to invest in the fossil fuel companies that are causing, that are selling these products, that are producing these products, and that are pushing very hard to make sure that little to nothing is done in the Congress because of their lobbying money. So there is an overture for the General Assembly to divest PCUSA funds from fossil fuels. That will be coming up in the upcoming General Assembly this year in Louisville. You can also have overtures or the equivalent in your presbytery asking them to divest. Several presbyteries have done this already, and in fact, National Capital, I'm proud to say, did it earlier this year. And the others have your church divest. And of course, as an individual, you can divest as well, because why should we all be benefiting? Why should we be profiting from things that are causing so much trouble? So with that, I'll stop and I'll hand it over to Bruce, and we'll see, do we have an opportunity to hear from some of the folks who are there?
Bill is here. Bill, would you like to? Bill was on national staff for many years, worked in environmental ministries as well as mission through responsible investment, and he holds the record having gone to 25 out of the 26 COP meetings. So he brings a wisdom of many years. If others of you have questions, please put them in the chat. You'll also notice people are sharing helpful links for further information. Bill, can you share a few pearls of wisdom with us from your many years of attending these meetings and how you think things went in Scotland?
Well, I think Mark covered most of the major agreements and declarations that did take place. It was a monumental task just to hold this COP in person. It was delayed because of the COVID pandemic, and even having it, we were daily tested and had to prove that you had your test before you could even enter the venue. Much of the usual things that would take place, for example, being able to hold meetings and various other kinds of discussion groups, et cetera, were limited to the fact that we had to socially distance in every room. And so there was a limitation on how many participants there could be. Fortunately, that did open up some possibilities, because there was the meetings were made online. You could participate. In fact, the Episcopal Church out of California monitored all kinds of stuff, and even had daily prayer services that were available. So there was a much broader participation of civil society as a result of that. Even so, there were about 40,000 people in Glasgow at one time or another. I would say that there was a lot, there was disappointment, particularly in the last day when India refused to allow the words of phasing out coal. And there was kind of a potential monkey wrench that got thrown in at the very last minute. The UN system is based on negotiation, and these are not, majority votes. These are basically mutually agreed upon decisions. And so within those limits, I think the COP accomplished a good bit, much more than we thought it would. On the other hand, it's very clear, as Mark pointed out, that we have so much more to do. I would say that we also have an opportunity in the United States to really get a little more active. For example, the USAID has out now the draft of their climate plan for the, I think the Department of Interior also has one. They're seeking citizen input. I think we need to be more aggressive into really participating and pushing the government through that, those processes. The second thing I would say is that civil society needs to push all companies, not simply fossil fuel companies, to get more aggressive. It's been shown that hundreds of US corporations have little or highly inadequate climate plans and commitments. If there was much more of a push, if they made more commitments to using renewable energy, we would create a much broader market, and hopefully that would be filled by increased use of solar, wind, and many other non-fossil fuel sources for energy. I think John Kerry said it in his last press conference: implementation, implementation, implementation. We need to become very aggressive in implementing all of these commitments. The faster we are, the more chance we have of keeping our goal or meeting our goals for the future. So, I think that it was an incredible experience. So many different groups participated. It's unbelievable the amount of commitment that's going on. The COP process has become the place to go and be for many organizations now. And as I noted, I think for the news service, the amazing participation of youth, women, indigenous peoples, and people from the lesser developed countries was fantastic in Glasgow. And we should be proud of the fact that over the years, it was really, I think, the faith communities that pushed for broader participation of those folks who've been typically omitted from the UN process. So onward, let's keep going. That's basically my, as I'm starting to decompress from traveling back from Glasgow in a very long day. So thanks, Mark, for summarizing all of the information. Many groups have not even had a chance yet to hold their Zoom conference calls to kind of debrief on everything. So there'll be much more coming out, I think, in the weeks ahead.
And thanks, Bill, for that input from someone who was there on the ground. That's very valuable. And one of the things is for implementation, part of the US implementation was in the infrastructure bill that was already passed. But a bigger part of it is in the Build Back Better plan that is, has been whittled down and is still before Congress. So this is one thing, and now that I'm retired and no longer a federal employee, I can say, contact your congressman, congresswomen, your senators, make sure that they are on board and they're pushing for as strong a Build Back Better plan as possible, because there are very important things that are in there that are necessary for US implementation. You're on mute, Bruce.
I try to do what I ask everybody else to do. Just a note in the chat, Bill's comments in the Presbyterian News Service are, the link to it is posted in the chat. Jane had a question, what about the fossil fuel companies? What were they doing in Glasgow? I think they were one of the largest groups in Glasgow, weren't they, Bill?
They were there, but they were obviously not there, actually, as far as I can tell, in the numbers that they had been in the past. There were a couple of the typical groups that are, I'd say, neoconservative or far right, Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, and a couple of others that come out every year. If you look through the registrations, there were a few people, but not very many from the major fossil fuel companies, okay. Surprisingly. That doesn't mean they weren't monitoring it and doing different things, but compared to previous years, it's not too much. There were 3, I think, Republican Congress people who showed up in the last week, who are part of the Republicans' Climate Caucus. These are folks who accept the fact that climate change is actually happening, but they have a much more, I'd say, market approach to trying to deal with it. And they made a big point of saying that they're there to have a different perspective, but they weren't there to throw a monkey wrench into any of the proceedings, which is far different than previous years when we had much more interference going on. Maybe others had different experience. I didn't. I mean, you got 40,000 people walking around, and they don't usually say, have a tag saying fossil fuel advocate on there.
Again, in the chat, pointing out that the House is voting on I can't say it quick here, the Build Better bill tonight. So pay attention. Carbon pricing may be part of the reconciliation package. Encourage your Democratic senators to include the carbon pricing as a possibility. According to
agreed. I mean, if there's not a better place that it could go than in the reconciliation bill, because you know, that clearly is something that deals with pricing, and so it would make a lot of sense.
Andrew just posted that there were over 500 lobbyists from the fossil fuel firms at COP26, so they were not shy. A few more than we had Presbyterians there. Other questions or comments?
I see some that are in the chat, just zipping back, starting from the top. I see Andrew had asked regarding emissions reductions, was the target really about net zero with carbon removal as compared to carbon neutral type offsets to reduce carbon? And the answer is yes. That's why I wanted to make a point of sharing that. All of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports that look at the budgeting, all of the external groups that look at budgeting to stay within 2 degrees, and especially for getting to 1.5 degrees, all require negative emission technologies. There's a tremendous amount of faith and expectation of a technological solution for part of the problem. It's very problematic. There are a lot of issues involved in doing that, and the most important of them is having a price structure that supports doing so, and that's one of the places that carbon pricing comes in. So yeah, it's important to realize that, you know, for most countries to get to where they say they're going to go, it requires a certain amount of negative emission technology.
Okay.
I would simply add on the numbers. The UN publishes a list of all the people who are registered at the COP. And that doesn't mean they all came, but they were all registered. The preliminary list was already up on the website. The final list will go onto the website. So if you have any interest in seeing what other faith groups were there, or universities and colleges or other organizations, you can do that. You can find it on the UNCCC COP26 website. And I did scan through the initial list to try to identify friends and foes, but I will do it again for when we get the final listing.
Other questions or comments?
I see one that just came in. Has the next conference date been set? Yes, these are annual conferences. So the conference next year, I believe, is in Egypt. Is that right, Bill?
Yes.
Yes, they announced Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt as the venue for next year. The year after that will be somewhere in Asia. They try to rotate around. So, and it will be in November again. And November seems to be the go-to month now.
Okay. Other questions and comments?
And for the comments that have come in regarding fossil fuel divestment, yes, I agree. It really is unfortunate that we haven't managed to get the General Assembly to approve it yet. So, work within your presbyteries to, and especially talking with your commissioners to this upcoming General Assembly. I have faith that we may be able to get it through this year.
We are behind.
We are
divesting. If you look at how many trillions of dollars have been divested, and the Presbyterians embarrassingly are behind. We are not close to being a headlight. We're not even a taillight, as Martin Luther King Jr. would say, when it comes to divestment. I did a presentation for a major church recently that had a $50 million endowment, and I was trying to find a church of comparable membership or wealth, and I could not find any Presbyterian congregation that was publicly of some size and wealth divesting. So it's not just at a national level, but we really need to work on a local level. Andrew, I believe, has a question or a comment.
I was writing in the chat, and I'll go ahead and post that. But yeah, it was just a reminder that it doesn't have to be, new technologies used to sequester carbon back into the earth. That they've done some amazing work in with rangelands, pasture land, just putting a half-inch, quarter-inch of compost on rangeland and carbon sequestration happening at really dramatic levels and for multiple years with just a single application. So the earth has ways to heal the planet, and we don't necessarily have to look to companies with fancy new technologies or that huge mega projects to go to negative carbon. Just wanted to add that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, and in fact, there's a documentary, in addition to Chasing Coral, if you haven't seen it, there's one that came out in 2020 called Kiss the Ground, which is a very good discussion about what can be done in terms of regenerative agriculture and a lot of ways that we can, in fact, use agricultural technologies and agricultural methods to sequester some of that carbon as well. It's not enough to get us there, but my feeling is we don't need silver bullets here. We need a whole lot of different approaches. And as many of these ideas as we can get functioning, the better. And so absolutely, regenerative agriculture is a great one.
Okay. I believe Kiss the Ground is available on Netflix, if I remember correctly, if you haven't caught that documentary. I am going to pause and let you all come up with your next questions, but I'm going to take advantage of being able to do a screen share and do a brief commercial for an upcoming Presbyterians for Earth Care project. This is the homepage for Presbyterians for Earth Care, and you can note that we had representatives there at COP. If you scroll down a little bit, here is an Advent devotional that we're excited about. It will be a daily devotional based on the common lectionary used on Sunday mornings in many of our churches. And we have all kinds of people writing for it. You may recognize some of these names, including a couple of people you've been hearing from. You will also notice there are a couple of spaces still to be filled out. So check that out and consider volunteering to help write. But more importantly, this should be available in the next few days so that you can promote it in your local church. And the idea is we want Presbyterians around the country being guided by Scripture, but looking at those familiar stories with a creation care bent to it. And hopefully that will inspire more and more people to get active in the multiple ways we all need to be working on this. So check that out on our website. Volunteer if you can write one quickly, but definitely help us in promoting it in churches so people will make good use of it. Are there other questions or comments for Mark or for Bill? I thought I'd give them a moment to pause and think about it. Well, folks, if you, oh, I've got something here. I've got a thank you. Good. If you look in the chat, I did post, in case you haven't had enough on climate change, I did post, if you scroll up a little bit, the link to Catherine Hayhoe's presentation this evening. Her new book, if you haven't picked it up, you should get it. If your library doesn't have it, you should donate it to them. But this is really trying to help us all communicate this better. So check out her program tonight or other ones she's doing. And the book is a good holiday read if you haven't had a chance to take a look at it. Any other comments, questions?
Bruce,
Yes.
someone asked if we could share all the links and everything in the chat. And yes, when we record the Zoom, we also record the chat. So we'll find a way to make everything that was in the chat available with the recording.
And Mindy, who is our wonderful coordinator, thinks that we probably will be able to get what you've listened to this evening up on YouTube tomorrow, probably, right? Was that what you were?
I will do my best.
And I saw one of our friends is pondering how to translate it possibly into Spanish. So all the more better to reach more and more people that we can work at this together. Any other questions or comments at this point? Jessica has been here. Be happy to promote Earth Care Congregations, our denominational program on organizing things at the congregational level. Do check out the Presbyterian for Earth Care website. We have all kinds of resources there that we hope congregations and individuals will find helpful. Anybody else? I think I saw Bill was plugging the carbon dividend program. I appreciate you doing that. Are there any other resources that people should be aware of that you want to share either verbally or in the chat?
I think fossil-free PCUSA was put in. Let me double check. Yes, it is. Rob Mark put that in.
Okay. You did a good comment about national and also local church. I would say we should also go after our educational institutions because they have sometimes significant endowments, and some like Princeton need a lot of encouragement, even though they have $1 billion. So we need to work on multiple levels for divestment.
Just let me congratulate PEC. This is the first COP PEC was accredited and actually had 3 people there and active participation by all 3. We had a great time working together. So I'm looking forward to all that. There were a number of other religious organizations there as well. But this is the first time that you all are active participants directly as Presbyterians for Earth Care, and that's really good. Another resource for those who may want to dive into the weeds a little bit more, the Earth Negotiations Bulletin that's put out by a group called IISD has a 40-page summary of the COP. It's on their website. So if you want to get a analysis plus coverage of all the different aspects of what's going on there, I encourage you to look at that.
Thank you, Bill. Any other comments or questions tonight, folks? Well, I think we can wrap it up. I know that Mark and I'm sure Bill also welcome you reaching out to them later and pursuing any questions and comments you might have. Presbyterians for Earth Care is here to serve the church, to serve the planet, and we welcome your active participation. Check us out on Facebook. We update information on it almost on a daily basis. Bill mentioned our 3 representatives in Scotland. They posted all kinds of perspectives, insights on the blog for Presbyterians for Earth Care, and you can go back and review, as well as links to other helpful resources related to COP26. Any other final word? If not, God bless, have a good evening, and maybe I'll see some of you joining Catherine Hayhoe's discussion right now. Take care, have a good evening.
Thank you all.
Thanks,
Great
all.
job.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Okay, we stop recording?